Hey, Kendra.
Hey.
So you're a coach leading research leadership mastery, where we work with clients. And so one problem that people often have, I have that problem myself, by the way. Like, what do you do when you have a team member who is not performing to your expectations? Like, how would you approach working with somebody who comes to you with that problem?
Mm. Uh, First, I'll echo that we all have that problem because we're humans working with humans. Uh, so I think the first thing that I'm always curious about is who's defining the performance and are they on the same page? Um, so like, do you have a specific example in mind?
Let me think about one. So, for example, in the past, I had a team member who would not do the things that we agreed on. So we would, and that was already on the backdrop of trying different things, right? I already tried letting them do their thing. I've tried agreeing on a plan. Um, and so they would just not do what they agreed on doing. Like there wouldn't be a weekly check-in. That is what we usually do. Um, they would not do the work, essentially, and not just the logistics parts of it, the administrative things, you check in, but the actual work.
I mean, I'll tell you first what old me would have done, which is that old me would have been like, oh, this one's broken. We should get rid of it.
Yes.
I would assume there was something faulty about the character and I would definitely have made the assumption that the student or person they simply weren't trying. I would assume they just weren't putting the work in. Um, I have a really different perspective on it now, which is that I want to understand where they are stuck. Um, so, I mean, how did you approach it with this person?
This is maybe an extreme example because there were like a lot of mental health challenges, but also personal challenges. And so in the end, there was just not a good solution to this. I think what it came down to was that this person was just not able to do the work. But that is like a very extreme example, more often than this, I find that I work with people who may not work in the same way that I do. So it's hard for me to understand. Like I'm a fairly efficient person. I'm a planner. It's hard to get an appointment with me next week or a meeting because my next week is probably already planned out. I also have acquired a certain discipline about my work. And so if somebody doesn't show up like that, which is actually the case for a lot of people who are new on my team or for graduate students just getting into this profession, they are not that organized. And so then what do I do, Kendra, when I come to you with this problem?
Yeah. Well, first, I want to just acknowledge that there's this idea that we all had to have a hierarchy of human needs. That's Maslow's triangle. And I think for a long time, academic culture excluded a lot of people, and it was only an option for those who had a lot of resources. So I think it's a relatively new thing in academics to recognize that we have students who may be facing food insecurity, who may be facing major issues of personal safety or like expectations of providing service to family or in other capacities as caregivers. So no one can perform good work if their basic needs are not met. And this is like a new area that we all have to figure out how to navigate. I'm not going to offer a solution or anything. I just want to really recognize that I think it's important to have those conversations, that we realize no one can perform when basic needs are not addressed, and that we do, as leaders and mentors, have a responsibility to understand that. So, being upset with someone because they're not performing when they're dealing with a major illness probably is not realistic. And the rest of the world has HR to deal with that, but like, that's kind of us. So just like one thing to sort of address. But when it comes down to, someone just not being trained up in some ways, I think like that's the best case scenario, is someone is simply missing basic skills, and we can skill them, and then you've solved the problem. I think that that's like a rare and lucky scenario, is that they just lack the skills of organization, and we can just train them in project management and organizational skills, and like the problem is solved. I think that's relatively rare. I think that a lot of times what we need to help people with is identifying sort of what their bigger goal is and figuring out how it aligns with the goal of the lab. So making, altruism, I can say this as someone who's studied ecology and behavior, altruism doesn't likely really exist, right? Everybody does something because they are getting something out of it. So effective, working effectively with a team means aligning those values and figuring out how working together will advance everybody. So I think that that's one of the ways that I would get really curious with someone about what is it that they're motivated by, what is it that they're trying to achieve, what is it that they want, and how can I frame each project in a way that hits on that deeper motivation for them. I think another thing that you mentioned that I'm going to ask more about, though, is you said that like you feel like their brain just didn't really work the same way. They didn't have sort of the skills and the framework, but then you also mentioned sort of like discipline and like tolerance. I think about this as tolerance for discomfort, because you can be making progress and learning something, but you may not have anything to show for it, and it might feel terrible. And I think that's another place where people can get blocked in developing a new skill or technique, because they assume that if it doesn't feel good, or if it doesn't seem like it's going well, that they're failing. And they sort of like shut down before they get through that entire process. That was a lot of thoughts.
Yeah. Right. No, I think like what I heard you say is you try to figure out what the real problem is, right? Digging a little bit deeper than what we're used to, or what well, like, to be honest, we're not trained to do any of this, right? We're not therapists. we're not trained leaders. I mean, we have to be honest about that, right? And so that's in part why I started doing what we're doing here, is to help people learn these skills that we need to really get at the root of the problem. And there are like two players to the equation, right? There is you working with your team member, but then there is also you working with you, because you have a reaction to the whole thing. And my go-to reaction in the past used to be frustration. I would get incredibly frustrated with people who wouldn't perform to my expectations, and especially would get frustrated because, in the working with me, I make sure that my expectations are reasonably realistic. Mm-hmm. And so, like, I feel like a lot of the work that we're doing with people is negotiating this, right? Like, what are my expectations? Are they really realistic? If they are realistic, how do I get somebody to up their expectations of themselves and their performance, right? Because if we excluded all these other things that are understandable, like, challenges at home, health challenges, like really feeling physically or psychologically unsafe, like there's still a lot of kind of opportunity for people to have these boxes checked and still not maybe performing to their full potential. And I think like this range is really fascinating to me, because that can be very frustrating, or it could be like your personal challenge, you know, to be such a great leader that you help people like get from, I'm like really underperforming with regard to my potential, to I'm tapping into my potential fully.
The idea of helping people tap into their full potential resonates with me so much, because after working with students for like 10 years, I've gone from assuming, you know, like, oh, this one's broken, better move on to the next one. Or, you know, I also went through this phase of like, oh, I just need to shout my expectations more loudly, right? Like, they're not meeting expectations. I just need to better communicate those expectations. I know I'll make up a new document of expectations, because I was working from this flawed assumption that we as humans are motivated by external benchmarks, right? Because that's how I had functioned. And the longer I've done this and the more I've reflected on it for myself and watched students go through this, I am really convinced that humans naturally create. We are innovative, like we are curious. The work of doing science is so naturally human, and we're so drawn to it that when people are not making progress, I think it is because they are blocked by self-doubt, disempowerment, discouragement, even by prior successes and fear of not meeting those prior successes, which like I can relate to. So, you know, I think that the work of really helping people comes from reflecting on those assumptions and those societal teachings and trying to figure out not like, how is this person broken, but what do they need?
Right. Yeah. And just recently, you know, I had a conversation actually yesterday with a student who I have known since they were an undergraduate student. And they were, I mean, I was so impressed then. But if I reflect for myself, impressed like based on these like standards that we're telling you should probably not be our be all end all standards. I mean, a student worked really hard, you know, as an undergraduate student. And so, you know, long story short, I recruited the student to my lab, and he's not showing up the way he did as an undergraduate student right now as a graduate student. And so we had this conversation, what is going on, you know? And like what they told me is that as undergraduate students, they hustled, and they are just not willing to do this anymore.
Huh.
And then I have to say that, like, yes, I get that, right? And that can't be all that there is to it, because student is also not, let's say, hustling during reasonable work hours. So, you know, and like doing this digging, I think this is what we try to also help people do when they show up with these kind of problems.
Yeah, I think at the very core of what's different about my approach now is that instead of looking at something and immediately drawing a inference or a conclusion about what I think is going on, I am much more curious. I think that I'm able to come to situations with curiosity that allows me to fully characterize the challenge and get a lot more creative about working around it. And I have a lot of hope for your conversation with your student. My recently graduated, like one of the most impressive students I think I've ever graduated. I remember when he was working on his first paper, the first draft was, I'm gonna say, nightmarish for both of us. And we had this conversation where I started asking him about how he was going about writing. And what came out of that conversation is basically, you know, I saw no progress and I was assuming he wasn't working hard enough, but it was the opposite. It was all he was doing from like the second he woke up all day long, just like chained to a computer, staring at that little blinking cursor. And he had been taught from a very young age that he was bad at writing. And he had been told all through his like earlier training that like he was great at doing field work and he was great at on the, you know, at the bench, but that he wasn't good at writing. And he'd internalized it so much that writing was like literally psychological torture. And so of course he made no progress. So we started a completely different strategy, which is that he was only allowed to work for really short bouts of time. And that he had to try like lots of different things. So we did, instead of doing a traditional outline, we did like post-it notes all over a wall. We did mind mapping. We did, you know, like all these things to kind of break out of that. Because once I understood that the problem was not his writing, it was his belief that he was a bad writer, then, you know, the process could become fun. You know, you could move past that block with all sorts of different problem solving. But I was trying to solve the wrong problem, right? Like I was trying to tell him to work harder, but that was not the problem. The problem is that he was really stuck.
Right. Yeah. So I guess like to sum it all up and bring it to a finish is there's just not one answer to the question, what do I do when my team members don't perform to my expectations? It's really like a twofold thing. Work with the person to understand where they are stuck, and then also work with yourself on your response to challenges like that, and to really understand, to gain self-awareness. I always say there are two types. Well, actually, I didn't say that. There's research that says there are two types of self-awareness. Number one is understanding like what drives you and what you want and what your vision is. And number two is understanding how other people perceive you. And that is actually one that's really interesting, I think, because as leaders, we sometimes lack that a little bit. And like as leaders, we have to have balance between these two different types of self-awareness in order to not be like totally narcissistic in a way, right? Like only driven by what we care about, but also not only externally driven, but still having an understanding how other people perceive us, because that shapes in how you like how you approach influencing that person. All right. So more about that in our leadership training, link in the comments. And see you the next time.